Okay, welcome. Thank you very much for making your time to come here in person, also join online. So today we're very delighted to have Dr. Donna Brunero to come here to talk about visiting the Liverpool of the East, Singapore's place in tours of empire. So let me just briefly introduce Donna here. Dr. Donna Brunero is a senior lecturer in the Department of History at the National University of Singapore. She teaches and researches on the British Empire in Asia, maritime history, and the interactions between the two. This has led her to publish on a diverse range of topics, including the British in the Chinese Maritime Customs Service, my favorite topic, Britain's maritime empire from the deck of the ship in her co-edited volume entitled Empire in Asia, A New Global History, and on family life for foreigners in the treaty ports in her another co-edited volume entitled Life in Treaty Ports, China and Japan. She has also published on Chinese shipping as depicted via the Mays collection of Chinese model junks. You can see those junks at the Maritime Museum in Greenwich. In her work with students and the teachers at Singapore's Ministry of Education, Donna has researched and delivered workshops on Singapore's history as a colonial port. She holds an ongoing interest in colonial heritage and legacies in Singapore's context. So without any delay, let's welcome Donna.
Okay. Thank you to Wei Pin, and thank you all for being here. I realize it's a Monday evening. It's also crazy, those of you who are teaching. So I really appreciate you spending your time, and those of you online as well. So the talk that I'm giving today, if you heard the introduction, Wei Pin and I are working on materials looking at East Asia and trade. However, I also work on Singapore, partly by virtue of being in Singapore, but I think something about being Australian, I'm very fascinated with the maritime. And so to be based somewhere which is one of the great port cities of the colonial era, but also the present day, I found that there was a lot that could be written about Singapore and a lot still to be researched in terms of the maritime. So I thought what I'd share with you today is some work, some that I've already sort of partly completed, some that's in progress, looking at the idea of royal tours and what it meant to be visiting what was considered the Liverpool of the East. So I thought we'll start with this. And basically, what does it mean for Singapore to be considered Liverpool of the East? And how and why did royal tours reaffirm Singapore's place in empire? So these are the types of ideas that I'm exploring. Okay, so let's just think about tours of empire. Singapore was a port of call for travelers, administrators, and researchers. It was part of an imperial network. Basically, Singapore was often brought into what was a celebration of empire when we think about tours. Work that I was inspired by was Charles Reid's work on imperial tours. He has a book looking at royal tours in particular. And he actually discusses in parallel the royal tour of 1901 with a much later tour. Oh, wait there, I've got to get this right. Okay, a much later tour to Singapore, which was with the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in 2011. Why Reid highlights this is that he sees that in both instances, tours are quite similar. Largely the role of the monarch was ceremonial. So you're really looking at these sort of tours to empire where members of the royal family are present, and in both cases really celebrated within Singapore. So again, just thinking that there are modern day sort of resonances. And if you're curious, in the background, so this is Gardens by the Bay, one of the newer developments in Singapore. So thinking about this, Reed contends that when we think about monarchy, empire, and royal tours, the royal tour has a particular significance because basically meanings of empire and the monarchy could be made and remade by those who were visited during these tours. Often tours formed a really visible connection or affirmation of imperial connections. And of what's important, or what I found really interesting, is how a colonial city or community would represent itself during these visits. So such tours had a role, particularly in the late Victorian period and into the Edwardian years, and they served an important role in terms of imperial propaganda. So this is where I want to think about two tours. So one is the Royal Tour of 1901. The other is the Special Squadron Tour of 1923 to 24, which was also called the Empire Cruise. I think they're both helpful for us in terms of thinking about manifestations of not just royalty, but imperialism and empire. And then at the very end, if there's time, what I've started to work on is the Silver Jubilee festivities in 1935 and how communities in Singapore began to discuss what's the best way to demonstrate loyalty. So some of you might find this work familiar, so I thought I'd put a book cover. What I found really interesting with this quote, right? So this is by Frost and Balasingham Chow, both Singaporean scholars, looking at globalization, and they observed that it had arrived and it came in a series of cliches by which European writers tried to capture its impact, right? And then they talk about, by the 1800s, Singapore was the Charing Cross of the East, the Clapham Junction of the East, the Liverpool of the East. You only had to tack on some major port or transport junction in Victorian Britain, tack on the words of the East, and there you had a description of Singapore. Okay, so I think there's something that really sort of stood out for me. I found that this description was quite handy for beginning to think about Singapore in this period. What I found was a fascination with wanting to not merely describe Singapore as an important seaport or maritime hub, but to see it as somehow mirroring an imperial center. So in terms of its development, trade characteristics. We can say in some ways that this trend of dubbing Singapore the somewhere of the East devalues such terms, but at the same time, it reinforces the way that this port city was viewed in a manner that was shaped by empire. So we're thinking about it being shaped by empire. That there is a consciousness that it has a place within an imperial framework. So this is the idea of placemaking when we think about empire. And quite often, the colonial encounter was not just about power and economics, but it was also about shaping the landscape and the way we think about the landscape. Now, dubbing Singapore the Liverpool of the East was not so much for the benefit of a local audience, or those in Singapore. What difference does it really make? But it may have been relevant or important for a British or Western audience. Because Liverpool, of course, was what regarded at this time as the second city of empire, one of the great port cities. So such a connection reaffirmed Singapore's place in relative terms. The term Liverpool of the East, I tried tracing it, is actually used as early as 1858 in discussions. So it's used in 1858 in parliamentary debates over Singapore's status, particularly the Straits settlements vis-a-vis India. The Encyclopedia Britannica of the 1860s entry on Singapore likewise described it as the Liverpool of the East by virtue of its status as a trading emporium. So Singapore held an important place in the British maritime sphere. Nearly all ships traveling the east-west route would pass by Singapore, if only briefly. So again, this title sort of really reaffirms, if you've not read it, the Singapore, a Biography book is a really great entry into Singapore's history. Okay, a familiar poster, I would imagine, for many. This is just bringing to the foreground the idea of imperial propaganda. Again, I found John Mackenzie's work particularly instructive in this area for thinking about the way images of empire were propagated and circulated, the Empire Marketing Board being one of the great producers of these images. So I thought it's just helpful to show one of the posters. These posters not only include images of empire builders and places of the empire, which gave Britons a sense of the reach of the empire, but quite often the maritime linkages are emphasized within these posters. And I think this is a really good example of that, where you see the maritime at the fore. So again, just reaffirming that maritime connections formed a really important ideological component of British Empire. We see the maritime again. Apologies if this isn't 100% clear, but this was a map from the P&O collection at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Again, just to give a visual sense of the networks and shipping, and once again, the important role that Singapore played in terms of thinking about maritime routes and connectivities. Okay, Singapore was a premier station for steamships. It was also very important as a coaling station. So let's look at Singapore as the Liverpool of the East. Okay, some picture postcards. Let's look at how Singapore was often viewed. So picture postcards is a really great medium for sharing images of Singapore, and these postcards will be collected and circulated. A very brief history of Singapore, incredibly brief. Singapore, of course, the Stanford Raffles is known as the founding figure. It enjoyed rapid growth in its early decades. It attracted merchants from across the region and also European merchants who were very keen to tap into not just an East-West trade, but an intra-Asian trade. So you've got multiple sort of convergence of multiple trade routes on Singapore. The Singapore River, and that's the picture on the left, is from the Singapore River, was really the focal point of Singapore's early development. So this is where the shipping, the unloading of the larger ships happened outside the river. All along the riverfront, you had the go-downs, so the warehouses where goods were being stored, loaded and unloaded. So this was predominantly the intra-Asian trade we begin to see. As shipping sizes increased with the advent of steamships, so did Singapore's development as a port, and the new harbour area was developed. With that, you have Western shipping, so that east-west shipping moving to the new harbour area. So you have this sort of flourishing of shipping taking place and multiple, as I said, multiple trade networks being tapped into. To make this trade possible was middlemen. So quite often these were Chinese from within the region, so Chinese that had been residing in places like Malacca or Penang, regarded as either the Straits Chinese or Peranakan. So this means Chinese that had a hybrid culture and quite often were adapted to the local environment. So they had a really important role in helping to facilitate trade and keep entrepot trade running. In addition to these Chinese communities, you had Parsis, Armenians, and Indians, so a really diverse and cosmopolitan community within early Singapore. Something you may or may not know, so the Parsis, for instance, are responsible for the first race course, horse track, very essential in any colonial port. And it was the Armenian Sakis brothers who built the Raffles Hotel and went on to build other very famous hotels in the region. So again, just a sense of a very cosmopolitan trading environment and trading entrepot. Regional traders were predominantly the Bugis, and there were trading seasons where these Bugis traders brought goods from throughout the region. So by the advent of the Suez Canal, Singapore's trade increased astronomically, and really Singapore was considered as an eminent and one of the busiest ports in the world. So technology basically reinforced Singapore's importance. So the steamship, the telegraph, and coaling stations. This is just setting a bit of context. Apologies if you already have that, but I think it's just helpful to give a little bit of a background. Now, being in a colonial port city, communities sought to demonstrate loyalty to empire, and this is one example. This is where the Chinese community gifted a statue of Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Victoria, to the chief of the Straits, the commander-in-chief of the Straits Settlement, Sir Cecil Clementi Smith, 1899. So there's a National Archives image of that. You can find the statue still in the National Gallery. So the reason I include this was just thinking about the way that loyalty of communities could be found through expressions that were either philanthropic, they were towards the built environment, and it's not so surprising then if there is news of an impending tour from members of the royal family that there would also be this sort of desire to demonstrate loyalty. So let's move to the first of the tours. Okay. So in 1901, the Duke and Duchess of York, the future King George V and Queen Mary, embarked on a worldwide tour of the empire. The tour was designed by Joseph Chamberlain and the Duke himself. It was a very ambitious tour, and it was the most ambitious to date. The tour was intended to inaugurate the new Australian Parliament, so it was meant to do quite a few things. The new Australian Parliament, and to convey Britain's appreciation for the ongoing support that had been rendered in aid of the imperial war that was ongoing, or rather dragging without solution in South Africa. So this was part of the intention of this tour. As part of their tour, the Duke and Duchess took part in a number of events, including tours, inspection of troops, and they were entertained by Indigenous communities. The tour had a particular significance for three reasons. It was the dawn of a new imperial century. The empire was still expanding. The cruise followed shortly after the death of Victoria. And the tour was also framed as an important continuation as a way of fulfilling Victoria's wishes. So the royal couple spent months at sea, traveling on the HMS Ophir and accompanied by a number of other ships. The fleet visited a number of key territories, and Singapore was one of these territories. So this tour celebrated empire and the monarchy, and it served to demonstrate imperial bonds. It was designed to not only celebrate, but to consolidate imperial bonds as well. And with this tour, there were official commentaries or official guides that were produced. So this is Web of Empire that was produced by Sir Donald Mackenzie. His observations are quite fascinating because he was considered a friend of the Duke, so someone that moved in similar social circles. There are other works that are written which give the perspective from below the decks, but this is very much one which was considered an official and sanctioned reflection on this tour. So for that reason, I think it's really interesting because here you have what is the official view of the places that are visited. Okay, so here we have the royal tour arriving in Singapore. So the fleet visited a number of key territories, including Singapore. The tour celebrated empire and the monarchy, and it demonstrated imperial bonds. It was designed to consolidate bonds. And now on the tour, on this cruise, there was some discussion. I don't have it here, but Mackenzie Wallace starts talking about the heat somewhere around the Straits of Malacca and talking about the way that no one could sleep in their cabins, that they all needed to come up onto the deck. This strikes true of many accounts of traveling around the region in Southeast Asia. And at first sight, Mackenzie Wallace describes Singapore as embedded in evergreens. And very soon, the fleet and the HMS Ophir was likewise embedded at a coaling station because it needed to refuel with coal. The Royal Highnesses were transferred to Johnston's Pier, and this is where officials and the leading inhabitants were ready to receive them. So this is one of the images of this event. The royal couple were then driven in an open carriage and a mounted escort through to Government House. Wallace commented on the hot and steamy weather, but found very favourable words for the good views, particularly the beautiful park of green lawns, which was intersected by red roads, and the good views from Government House, which is today's Istana. He then also talks about the jungly country that he found around the harbour. Okay, so jungly country being part of it. Okay, so this is some of the official views. Here's another one. This is a street scene. Again, you see buildings all festooned and the royal couple being conveyed through the streets. The arrival of the HMS Ophir was heralded by the Singapore Free Press as the greatest imperial event since the founding of the Straits Settlements. So really seen as a major event. Frost and Balasingham Chow, in their work that I highlighted earlier, they argue that this event was evidence of the rise of an Asian or Anglophone elite within these celebrations. For instance, Sinhalese jeweler and philanthropist De Silva was tasked with organizing many of the displays and for overseeing the crafting of lavish gifts for the royal couple. Certainly, local elites were brought to the fore in receptions, and I've got some images of that shortly. But of course, any ceremonies during this visit were often shaped by imperial notions of British rule and a hierarchy within that in terms of who should be presented to the royal couple. What we should bear in mind is the notion of the royal tourist and the way that local populaces were often brought into what was the spectacle of the event. There were also issues of protocol and social expectations. And now one anecdote that I found, which was only recounted after the visit, and I think this is always very important. You don't want to tell people at the point of the visit. So it speaks to collective concern and a rather ingenious improvisation when it was discovered, much to everyone's distress, that guests lacked sufficient gloves to be able to greet the royal couple. So the newspaper then said what we came up with, the locals came up with a plan, an arrangement to surreptitiously pass the gloves along without the royal family or without the royal couple discovering. So it meant that all those who needed to greet the couple could do so with the required gloves. So this appeared in the newspaper after the event, but it was seen as local ingenuity to get around what was a tricky situation. And I would guess also not wanting that deficiency to be noted in any official accounts. Right? So the deficiency wasn't noted or wasn't noticed. Now, here's one of the images. And again, this is from the Web of Empire. So this is from the official account. So if this tour was about monarchy being made accessible to empire and to its colonial subjects, it was also about the way that local elites and rulers were often brought into submission into rituals that recognized British power. For instance, there were Durbar-like ceremonies held in a number of ports and adopted beyond the formal British Raj, and local rulers were expected to take part. According to press accounts, a Durbar was held in Singapore during the Duke and Duchess's visit. And so here, Singapore was brought into part of a larger imperial experience. So a feature of the visit was the local Malay rulers and chiefs and their retinue from the Federated Malay States arriving to call on the royal couple. So this is one of the images. So just realizing that the Federation of the Protected States occurred in 1896 and had grown and continued to expand. Wallace's account of the royal couple's visit to Singapore highlights the fact that Malay rulers were an important part of their visit to Singapore. And this corresponds with what Frost and Balasingham Chow have observed, that Indigenous local elites were given a high profile within this royal visit. Wallace describes the audience of Malay rulers as a picturesque gathering with groups kept carefully apart. Here, I think Wallace may have wished to impress on his reader his awareness of the unrest between different Malay states, or even more so to perpetuate the stereotypes of rivalries and conflicts in the Malay Peninsula that the British rule helped to keep in check. So you think about why Wallace might want to emphasize this. Wallace described these groups as dressing in their national costumes, but also that these clothes were bright and pleasing in color, but too tight to drape gracefully, and so aesthetically being more curious than beautiful. So again, this is really an imperial gaze. The royal couple were presented with a rich array of gifts, many of which were handcrafted in the region, including walking sticks with ivory, gold and diamonds, and an ornate kris, so a ceremonial dagger. Audiences between the royals and elites were an opportunity for Wallace to recount many of the power dynamics at play in this part of the empire. For instance, several rulers were depicted as more amenable to British rule and British values. Wallace discussed the differences between various rulers, identifying some as being old school in preserving traditional ancient court costumes and never learning English. Such rulers were described as scheming against the British at every opportunity. And these rulers were then contrasted against others, such as the Sultan of Perak, who was described as educated in English, dressing in more modern style with some hybrid European dress, and expressing his appreciation of the influence of the British. Again, a really interesting overview of the dynamics of the different elites and the way that they were regarded by the royals and by Wallace. Wallace took time to walk in the public civic areas, and he had very positive reflections to make. His concluding assessment of Singapore speaks to the idea of progress, and it's very self-congratulatory. The local press gave extensive coverage to this royal visit, and on a few occasions, the links to Raffles' legacy were highlighted as explaining the success of this colonial port city. Wallace explained that it was the officers who assisted in this miracle of transformation in what he described as the lusty bantling of Sir Stamford Raffles, and who had created a well-developed settlement as a result, that they had brought profound change to the Malay Peninsula. So these observations and the cruise reaffirmed Singapore's place within empire, and it also served as an important place for observing the Malay Peninsula. It was also instructive as to how the British had persevered in developing this settlement. So there's always this discussion about from something squalid to a transformation, which is a very common narrative in Singapore's bigger story, bigger history. Okay, so that is my coverage of the earlier cruise, the earlier tour. I'll just move to the Special Squadron tour. So it's fairly brief. So this is something which occurred, we're looking at the Special Squadron tour, it's roughly a century ago. This is another example of Singapore's connections in the British imperial world. And it was important because it was selected as a port of call in the Special Service Squadron cruise, which is better known as the Empire Cruise. Okay, so this map gives you a sense of where the cruise is covering. It took place in the lull between what would be two world wars, and saw the British Empire at its fullest territorial extent. This was tempered, however, with a concern that the British Empire was overstretched and needed support. So the driving motivation for this cruise then was to make a visible demonstration of British naval might, but at the same time to encourage dominions and territories to do their part in bolstering their naval defences rather than just relying on the Royal Navy. A journalist and author, V.C. Scott O'Connor, travelled with the fleet to give an on-the-spot account of this world-encompassing voyage. Okay, so a series of ships, 6 of His Majesty's ships, the Hood, Repulse, Delhi, Dauntless, Danae, and Dragon, set off, and they were described as having a destiny to voyage around the world to meet their kinsmen overseas and to carry a message of peace and goodwill, and to revive the ties that bound people together within empire. So this cruise was to encompass 38,000 miles around the world. And while there were no members of the royal family on this tour, King George sent messages via his admirals to convey his fond memories of his royal tour in 1901 and his high regard in particular for Singapore. So of course, the Singapore press immediately wanted to relay that to everyone. He's not forgotten his visit to Singapore. It was also a chance for the Navy, now I'm not a naval historian, but I know that this is impressive, was to show off the HMS Hood. This was really a chance to showcase. This was the focus of particular adulation as the fastest and most powerful and most expensive ship in the world. This cruise was also not just documented, so you've got V.C. Scott O'Connor who's writing about it. It was also captured on film, and it's a film, 6-part film series titled Britain's Birthright. And this film series is held in the Imperial War Museum archives. If you did want to watch parts of it, Singapore on Film has some clips of this, so there's a documentary which also shows some clips. So the film, just like earlier royal cruises, is heavily didactic, demonstrating to home audiences and to subjects of empire the benefits of the British Empire, the power of the British Empire, and the fact that colonies and dominions had a role to play with sustaining the imperial network. So this is from the cover of the book, the inside. So this is V.C. Scott O'Connor's work, The Empire Cruise. So this tour had different aims to that of a royal tour, but it reaffirmed Singapore's place in the imperial context because Singapore was deemed a port worthy of not only visiting, but staying for some days. Now you have to think about regional dynamics at that time. Singapore was always looking to make sure Penang didn't get too many benefits. There was always a bit of rivalry. So the fact that Singapore would be the main port of call in Southeast Asia was, again, something that was really celebrated. And the cruise was chronicled by those on board and also via film. And even V.C. Scott's account spends a lot of time talking about tonnage, guns, and the capabilities of the HMS Hood. So again, there is that stronger sort of naval dimension. Okay. So the battle cruisers sailed from Port Swettenham, which is Port Klang, and arrived in Singapore in heavy rain in February 1924. They were joined by a number of vessels from the China station as well. The following day, the fleet addressed ship, and they were joined in this by every merchant ship in order of the occasion. The Vice Admiral, Rear Admiral, and all of the captains for the Special Service Squadron landed and met with the Governor of the Straits Settlements, Sir Lawrence Guillemard, and they were driven through crowded streets. Singapore gave a resounding welcome to the visiting squadron, as demonstrated through this poster. And so this poster is something that's held in the National Museum of Singapore collection. Here through this poster, we see Selamat or welcome. The poster reflects a celebration of empire in many ways. In the poster, we see a British sailor. The Jack Tar is a symbol of not only naval, but imperial masculinity, being welcomed by a personification of Singapore. And you notice Singapore's tiara has a palm tree on it. Yes, it's a diadem, a tiara adorned with a palm and a lion. The image of Singapore is one that is imperial and regal. So this is again quite an interesting depiction of Singapore, and it was produced by a local cartoonist, Dennis Santry, who was an Irish-born architect living in Singapore and a partner with a very prominent architecture firm, Swan & McLaren. So in some ways, this focusing was a shift, I think, maybe away from a really exoticized Singapore, such as the pictures of the Malay chiefs, to something which is shaped much more with imperial classical illusions. So in this way, it's a celebration of a modern colonial port. What I also found interesting is this quote. Once again, whenever there are these tours to visit Singapore, there's quite often a reflection on Singapore's growth and its tremendous transformation. The idea of it being cosmopolitan is something that is highlighted over and over again. The role of the Chinese community is something that is often highlighted, and they are numerically the largest ethnic group within Singapore quite early on. And of course, the emphasis added was, we may claim without pride, the constructive genius of our people. So quite often there are discussions about it's an against the odds transformation which has taken place. The other provisions that were made, particularly with this visit, seeing that it was a few days, and I've not been able to find pictures of this, was that even the sailors within the squadron were very much welcomed within Singapore. They paraded through the streets. Clubs were made available to them for recreation, sports clubs, and so on. So there really was a sense of the colonial community embracing this particular fleet. There are also many gun salutes that took place, not as an act of war, but to welcome local elites. So again, anyone who was of note was generally greeted with a gun salute and could go and visit one of these vessels while they were anchored. So again, there was a sense of the whole community being very excited, and it's not just a visual spectacle, but the spectacle of these large ships and firing gun salutes over and over again, depending on who was visiting. Okay, so this was just an overview of the two ports, the two cruises. So by examining very briefly two of the most prominent cruises of the empire, we have an illustration of how Singapore was viewed as a prized asset in a larger maritime network, one that was bonded not just by naval force, but by the movement of goods and people and ideas. And one of those ideas was loyalty to the empire. The cruises were intended to unite, promote unity and a sense of connection. And perhaps it's with this in mind that describing Singapore as a Liverpool of the East evokes a certain image of an imperial outpost that embodied not only the progress and growth of empire, but had lasting connections to British maritime power. What I wondered was whether these cruises gave rise to, or at least helped to sustain, a much longer history of Singapore being described as a quintessential hub of the East. The Empire cruises and the Royal Cruise set the tone for the era for describing people and places of empire. As scholars, I think we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss these frames of reference for Singapore, however laden they are in a colonial past, because their legacy, in fact, continues. The museum, the National Museum of Singapore, for instance, as part of its permanent gallery on Singapore, has a section called the Liverpool of the East, so within the National Gallery. Mary Turnbull's classic tome, A Modern History of Singapore, offers a chapter on the Clapham Junction of the East. And more recently, in light of Singapore's move to become a knowledge economy, Singapore's been termed the Boston of the East. This is by former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong in the 1990s. So then the reference here may not be colonial, but it's unmistakably aspirational. Singapore has also been described as the Venice of the 21st century. So there is this desire to attribute certain qualities. The wild terms such as Liverpool of the East were bandied about, particularly in the age of high imperialism, and have somewhat been set aside. There is still an urge to try to describe Singapore as a hub, which remains very pervasive even in the modern nation state. And I have two examples from a very simple search, which is thinking about Singapore Inc. as a global hub for brands and businesses. So this is in the last couple of months. And another one as a global tech hub. So there are often these descriptions of Singapore as a hub, which come up over and over again. Now, if there's just a few minutes, I'll just share with you something that I'm working on. So this is developing from what I've been thinking about with these tours and that imperial history connection. I started looking at the Silver Jubilee. And what I was particularly interested in was to think about how local communities celebrated the Silver Jubilee of 1935. So at this point, I've only given, I think, one conference presentation on this, so I've not really developed it very far. But I see it as a development in a similar thread. In this case, what I found really interesting is that for this Jubilee, there were newspaper reports and discussions in particular explaining why it was important to show loyalty, why it was important to demonstrate loyalty, and that this should simply not be a matter of being concerned about expense, given it's the 1930s. So there were some financial constraints. Leading members of the Anglophone Chinese community wrote really long articles explaining why Jubilees are important. So giving a history of the Jubilee itself, so why are such celebrations important, and then explaining it in the context of Singapore. So again, I found that really interesting that you've got leading figures basically giving public lectures on why we need to have such celebrations and why we should have a role to play. And it was something that the authorities were quite quick to actually highlight that each community would be able to represent themselves as they saw fit. Now, I think this is something that wasn't so apparent in earlier celebrations, right? That communities could choose the manner of celebration. So there is a lot more autonomy. So I found that really fascinating. And there's a souvenir book that was produced, and public lighting became one of the main sort of ways for Singapore, the urban centre, to demonstrate this sort of celebration. So you have civic buildings, some private buildings as well, all being lit up with messages such as God Save the King. So I found this really fascinating that there is a public spectacle angle to this and wanting to show the technology aspect as well, because power stations are still relatively new, and to be able to light up on this scale for extended periods of time. So each evening was considered quite a feat in itself. Hence, there is a souvenir booklet of pictures that look mainly like this, which we would say is pretty unremarkable now, but at the time, these were being sold as collectibles. So there's a few more. There's a discussion of the Jubilee souvenir, again, describing that it will be the most outstanding celebration and that Singapore's celebrations would be hard to beat in terms of the region, looking at how much the municipality spent, so looking at $50,000 on public decorations. So again, I need to do more research to work out where this sits in the scheme of public spending, for instance, because I'm sure it would have raised a discussion. Okay, so just thinking about it, and the idea that the city itself could be transformed by night into a celebration of the monarch, but also empire. This is John Little and Co. So again, looking at some of the decorations and bunting and long live the king, messages across the front. So really sort of, again, another celebration of a much bigger connection that Singapore had as a colonial port city and the way that communities were involved. That said, I found that there are still images like this. So this was a reenactment of a Royal Malay wedding. So what I found fascinating here within the same booklet is that this image is very similar to thinking about the royal durbars that appeared earlier on, so that sort of pageantry. It's something that is staged, so it's staged as a wedding. So it does take, and this is some 30 years after that other royal visit, the royal tour, you still have these events which take on almost like an ethnographic angle. So I found that quite fascinating in terms of, and this is what I'm trying to explore, who actually helped put this together? Was this something that the Malay community had a hand in, or is this more the municipal authorities saying we must still have these ethnographic representations of Singapore? So that's where my research is at this point in time. And I'll just say thank you all for listening, and I'm welcome to take any questions you might have. Thank you. Yes. Oh, okay, lots of questions.
Oh, sorry.
Facilitation to work. It's people who can't hear questions on the Zoom, when they're given down here, they don't relay very clearly onto the Zoom. So hopefully these microphones above your head will be picking it up and sending the Zoom. And we find out. So we can.
All right, so like happy to take questions. So let's start with the people in the room first, then we move on to questions on Zoom. So anybody would like to? We have you first, and yeah, yes, please.
Yeah, how much did Hong Kong, which my father's friend worked in since the 1960s, take the shine off Singapore, because obviously it was further north, in Fula, a bit more developed. I don't know, did it take a lot of trade in Singapore to make trade?
Talk about taking the trade off, but and for this I was really focusing on Singapore. But there is a rivalry which goes on between Singapore and Hong Kong. I see that there are great parallels between the two colonial plots. There is a rivalry, but I think Hong Kong has the edge with some aspects, particularly shipbuilding, for instance. So I think it's a constant competition, but Singapore's place in terms of as a coaling station and as the main sort of Southeast Asian base is something that it can hang on to. But it's often looking at what Hong Kong is doing. I mean, the more immediate rivalry is places like Penang, and this is because they have that history already, that they were part of the Straits settlements. But Hong Kong is a much bigger rival or sister port city in that way. So I don't know if that answers it exactly, but certainly they are aware of that. And maybe what I need to do is look at some of these visits, these tours, and see how Hong Kong is being described, and then maybe compare. Often with Singapore, the description is much more about the jungle and it's much more about the Malay Peninsula. So it becomes a point to understand the rest of the region.
There's also geographical differences. I mean,
Yes.
Hong Kong is not connected to Australia, for example. Whereas Singapore is in the whole Indonesian archipelago and so on. So Hong Kong and Macau were looking to China more than Southeast Asia.
Singapore is definitely aware of what's happening in Hong Kong and quite often trying to monitor, because there will be an impact if Hong Kong flourishes in a particular area. Then Singapore might find that industry goes down a little bit or declines a little bit. So there is certainly concern about the two relationship.
Well, it's different now because Singapore is almost still independent, whereas Hong Kong is trying. It doesn't have that independent free hand.
And I think Singapore has accepted that it has been overtaken by many Chinese port cities in the present day. For a long time, Singapore was still hanging on to that really global position, but I think it's just been outpaced by these really big ports in China in a contemporary city.
It's next year, please.
Thanks, Donna. The most striking thing for me about your presentation is how it completely debunks the post-colonial narrative of Singapore being a third world fishing village. And not meaning to draw you into current day Singapore politics. In your work, do you detect, during the period of your work, do you detect any use of imagery of Singapore as a fishing village or development? Or is it a post-colonial invention?
Okay, Okay, well, that's a really good question. I think there definitely are images, if you want to look at some picture postcards, there'll certainly be picture postcards of what would be dubbed Malay villages, or, local fishing communities, which is very much the kampong, the coconut trees, so it's very stereotypical. I think the images of the Malay princes begins to sort of fall into that. But Singapore, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about Singapore as a modern port, and that was what something that interested me. I've not been able to grapple with. What does it mean for Singapore to be modern? It's not the same as Liverpool, by all means, but the idea that you could light up public buildings, that you had a world-class coaling and shipbuilding facilities, these were all seen as markers of the modern, but in an Asian context and a colonial context. I don't know if that answers it exactly, but I think it's something Singapore is also grappling with, because you look at the built environment and, it had its own sort of fund and, the infrastructure in the built environment is not a fishing village by long shot.
So we can you first and then you and then Andrew.
Yeah, why did Clapham Junction get so much of a mention? Let's go the numbers of the visiting mariners.
Yeah, maybe it's just the traffic. Maybe someone could help me with that. I thought it was really to do with traffic and junction.
There's a Clapham Junction in Malta,
I don't.
of prehistoric routes which cross each other. That's what they call it.
Okay, so it's to do with that crossroads, I think it must be, but I think the Liverpool East seems to be what has stuck with people the most. I mean, just to explain, I partly started this research because it was the bicentenary in Singapore. And the funny thing, it's not really that funny, but I would have people coming up to me saying, "You're a historian, lucky for you, it's bicentenary. You're really popular now." So it's like every 200 years we're in vogue. But it was, I didn't want to produce something on Raffles particularly. And I had colleagues saying, "Oh, there's something on maritime." And I said, okay, this is sort of bugged me. Why this expression and what does it mean? So I'll use that as my way of thinking about Singapore's history rather than yet another paper on Raffles. Yes, please.
If you'll allow me to sort of go on slightly, I was thinking there was a mutiny, wasn't there, in 1915, where part of Singapore passed out of the control of the government. I wondered if that had any resonance, I mean, did it get support with the civilian population or?
No.
You see, I just wonder if there's some idea that you need to sort of reaffirm imperial loyalty after that.
I think not so much. It would more have affected which troops were being based in Singapore, because my understanding was that mutiny was suppressed very quickly. And it wasn't all soldiers involved, so it was only a disaffected group. And so the moving of more British troops into places like Singapore would just simply remove any problems.
Andrew first.
Many thanks for the talk and the images. One of the Malay chiefs was a very striking image. And I was wondering how much Singapore saw itself as part of the Malaysian archipelago, or part of the Malaysian states, as opposed to being an individual entity suddenly becoming much more modern in contrast to the Malaysian state. And linked to that, how much impact these two tours had filtering through the Malaysian states, or was it rather confined to Singapore itself?
Oh, okay. I think the connections between the two places are actually very close, so you're right. Because if you have the causeways, you have the connection, and Singapore essentially became the port through which many of the staple goods from the Malay Peninsula were being shipped. So they would be brought down from the peninsula into Singapore, and from there either refined or processed in things like tin and rubber, for instance, pineapple as well. So Singapore was really very connected economically, but also cultural connections and even communities. So imperial careering, you might be in Singapore, you might be in the Malay Federated States, for instance, so you would travel around. So I think there were very clear connections. There's rivalry between the two places. A lot of people would travel
throughout the Malay Peninsula. So you didn't see yourself as just strictly Singapore, certainly not in the modern sense of it. It was part of something larger, but it was the premier port. So I think that's answered some of your question. In terms of celebrations, other cities held celebrations as well, particularly for the Jubilee. So, and there is some scholarship on that, looking at the way that different communities decided to celebrate. So certainly they did, but the fact that, particularly for these cruises, Singapore was always selected as the bigger port of call. So if it was somewhere like Penang, it might be very briefly for a couple of hours to either gather some supplies or something like this. It was never such an extensive visit. So I think this is why Singapore saw itself as something somewhat special, because it was always the preferred port of call and often for extended visits when it came to the royal couple, but also the squadron. Hopefully that's answered some of your question. Yes, please.
Do you have any sense of how much of this jubilation is it forced on people? I mean, 300, it's got a few republics in there, right? And we know that Special Branch, you know, out of Shanghai at that time, looking over Singapore was paranoid about Indian independence movements and things. In 1935 was an enormous scandal and a total damp squib in Shanghai, particularly. I don't know what happened in Singapore. I mean, is anyone really interested in this, or is this just British newspaper editors telling us it's fantastic?
Well, that's a good question, because this is why I was quite surprised to find that the meeting members of all the Chinese community are the ones actually giving the public lectures about why we need to hold this Jubilee. And it's not a matter of the money, it's about loyalty, and it's not for us, but it's to demonstrate to younger generations why this matters. So I think there are discussions, and this is what I want to get into more in terms of, is there dissent within those communities and to what extent? Although I'm dealing with mainly the Anglophone communities that are publishing, that are writing in English and giving public lectures, for instance. So that might be something that I need to look at a little more and see where the dissent, if there is, where it is. Certainly the cost seems to be something that comes.
Just disinterest, right? You don't have to actually dissent. You can just stay at home and not put the telly on to watch the Queen.
I don't know what I was telling you, but it could, I mean, some of the earlier accounts about the royal couple visiting, some young people are sort of interviewed as a reminiscence, and they're saying the big excitement wasn't to see the royal couple, it was that they were given the day off school to actually go and to line the street. So often it's about just being brought into the spectacle of something that is grand and wondrous. You don't necessarily need to understand the full. I think there was a little bit of that thinking at the time as well. Yes, yeah, exactly, you see. So I think there was that element as well. So I do wonder, and this is where for the 1930s, as I said, I've only really just sort of started this, but it was partly in response to being asked, you know, working with scholars that look at monarchy. So scholars such as Robert Aldridge and Cindy McCreary, so they're Australian-based scholars. And I was saying, I want to do something on this because living in Singapore, you see a lot of the built infrastructure is very imperial and colonial. How was it understood in this period? I mean, there are longer legacies, of course, but scholars haven't really, apart from the very standard histories, they just haven't looked at these events so much.
Yes, please. Because none of my area was very small, but I was very intrigued by the reference to fairyland in the newspaper of 1935. So I wondered if the notion of fairy was part of Chinese and Malay culture, or was it important for Western culture?
Actually, it's a good question. I actually thought that, to me, there seemed to be a bit of a parallel to work that's been done in Hong Kong, looking at the peak. And the idea of children's fates and pageants, that there's this sort of transformation to a fairyland and magical. I would think, but again, it could be something that I look at a little more to see. I would think it's more a Western orientation.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Just not a question, just suggestion or opinion. Because okay, you know, okay, I always think about the comparison between Hong Kong and Singapore, not only in the present, also in the past, also in the before the World War II, and the connection between the Hong Kong and Singapore. And your research, I know the last part of your presentation is about how the people, maybe Chinese people in Singapore, how to celebrate the Jubilee anniversary of the king. You see, for me, maybe you can see they want to celebrate their so-called Britishness or their connection to the empire. This make me, because in the recent last year there is a Hong Kong scholar. She is a lecturer in the University of Bristol. She is Vivian Kong. Her book is called Multiracial Britishness: Global Networks in Hong Kong from 1910 to 1945. This means the interwar period. I think is it possible to compare at least the Chinese people in Singapore, Chinese community in Singapore, and the Chinese people in Hong Kong, compare how they are so-called celebrate, or how they show their connection or sentimental connection to the empire.
No, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you for that
Yeah.
recommendation. I think there's potential, but then also thinking about Singapore's some of the Chinese community being mostly Peranakan, so
Think Chinese or
So their orientation might be a little different in terms of the way that they see themselves as a very distinct community. I think there's definitely a parallel comparison with the.
Sorry, the comment rather than the question, you've probably been on the Australia.
Yes.
Yeah, well, you probably know about Keating. I remember he did a referendum on the Republic. He thought that monarchy was outdated, and people thought he won. And it was funny because I think that represents a lot of Australia. I think it's like today, we're pretty good at monarchy, probably not. We look at our politicians. They're like Nick Keating, they've got the kids on. I think they're nice, awful people. But we got the monarchy, and the monarchy may not be perfect, but it's better than what we got from Parliament. If we have the problem we have President Blair or something, I think it's more like the lesser of two evils. I think that's why I like the empire. But I think it's more important. You don't know who this king is. This is the other side of the planet. But he's better than that local magnate who's running the following. I think there's a lot of that going on.
I think you're right, and there is an awareness, particularly if it's more in different communities, that this is where there is mobility, right? So mobility in terms of English being the language of power, this is the place where you can go and study. So many young Singaporeans or young Chinese in particular that have gone to London, to Cambridge and elsewhere to study, and that is an empty pathway. So it was an opportunity for mobility within the I think they're also very conscious.
The other one just quickly mentioned Canada, because it's got three things going on there. Because they don't want to be a Republic of America. They are buying Trump, Harris, it's a Rocky Mouse, not. Well, we got the Queen. And the other things, two other things. One is the native people, not the actual British, but the free, we've got the Inuit, the Eskimos, as we call it. They can appeal to the Queen against one of the governments doing possible. So they have that sort of point of appeal, the Queen's on their side. And the other problem is we got through that, very popular level. He's gone, we can actually be the president. And there was no thank you. So there's three things going. Looking at the states, looking at what Canada, what we said in Australia, but also looking at the powers that gave the native people extra power. This is like what the government's doing locally, they could appeal to monarchy. So some of these things were overturned. So sometimes we help those people against the government. So there's a lot of things going on. It's a very complex web. Not I'm a fan of empire, but there were things, constitutional things that sat in the empire, which protected local people from the certain excesses that happened. And I'm sure Singapore had similar examples. I mean, Hong Kong, just think of how when China took over, certain powers were protected. So, democratic right, protected for a period, shield them from the excesses of Beijing, reading on. I think there's a bad and good side of the British Empire, I guess.
Yes, and I think you're right in terms of there's more to unpack. This is still very sort of early days, particularly looking at the 1935. But again, it interests me partly just to think about, so what was the local response to? It's one thing to say that there is this celebration, but then look at
what's the discussion that's going on? I need to get into the municipal council records and have a look at how they justify spending a certain amount of money just on lighting, for instance. And discussion about, are there concerns about people being unhappy about how they're depicted, for instance, so it's a really interesting topic, I think, to get into.
Donna, could I just ask you this question about this image that when the Queen's statue was represented in the 1880 something, I noticed some people in the crowd, they were in the kind of Qing government uniforms.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, do we know any background about why these Qing officials were there?
Okay, the short answer is they're most likely not Qing officials. So the Qing authorities would generally, when they're running out of money, would come to places like Singapore and actually sell titles. So there was a whole sort of routine where they would advertise that they were coming to different ports. They would advertise what titles you could purchase, because if you were in Singapore, quite often you're a business person, you're not a literati. And so within Singapore, there are some examples where you go to a Peranakan house or museum, and you can look at the portraits, and some of the portraiture will be of what looks like Qing officials. It's not, it's the titles have been purchased, maybe not just for yourself, but for your sons. Then you might go back a couple of generations and just buy the titles for other family members. So to create your own lineage. So that would be my take on it, basically.
Very, very interesting. Yes, yes.
I don't think we have questions from the audience.
Online, no.
Online.
Sorry, online, yeah.
No, yes, I checked that, it was clear.
Okay. Any more questions
Very good for that.
in the room? Yes, please.
Could I ask about the usage and the implication of some of these comparisons? So with Liverpool being the second city, is the comparison Singapore being the Liverpool, is it in relation to Calcutta as the London? Or is it, I mean, is it any ever used in that sense as a way of calling it the second city? And then the other comparison is thinking about these railway junctions as a metaphor for what is a city. A railway junction doesn't develop a civil society or a normative form of politics, right? It's a place with a transient population, maybe officially sort of employed functionaries, but it's not a city. Is it used in a pejorative sense to demean port cities like Liverpool, to call it a Clapham, Clapham Junction? Is it ever used in that way, or is it just a very simple, it's a place where lots of lines meet and there's nothing more to it?
Actually, it's a good question. I think that there's not so much more to it.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to look a bit further. The comparison saying Liverpool as the second city, whether there's a comparison to say Calcutta, I've not really seen that. It's more to do with the maritime dimension, and that Singapore is regarded as this sort of really pivotal, large, major shipping, centre for shipping, for coaling, for shipbuilding, and for that reason, to describe it as the Liverpool, these seem to be a way of describing it.
Yeah.
There's not so much mention of Calcutta, actually.
All right, I think we have all the questions answered. So thank you very much. Please do join us for drinks. Yeah.
Give me a lot to think about now.